So my, my name is Martha Chan, and I've been caring for my husband, Waho.
My name is Sheila Martin, and my father is no longer alive, but I was taking care of him for a few years.
My name's Sue Bendrum, and I don't want to take credit as primary caregiver away from my brother, who's living very close to my dad. And I'm a couple hours away, but I'm filling in as possible.
I'm Jasmine Coran from San Mateo, and I'm caregiving for my mom alongside with my father. We are rotating.
I'm Mark Rodden. I'm an only child, and my father had Alzheimer's disease, and I was pretty much in charge of making sure he went well through that.
I'm an only child too. My name is Emmy Gusakuma, and I live in Foster City. My parents both had dementia, and I was a caregiver for about 12 years with the help of professional caregivers.
My name is Gloria Brown, and with the help of two caregivers, one for my husband and one with my mom.
I think it was very challenging for us as a family to really talk about it because the community had viewed her as this person who, you know, is so capable and able. And I think there was this part of her that was just, she knew she was having lapses as well and was having a difficult time talking about it. Specifically with my mom, I mean, she's one of the 200,000 Americans with the younger onset Alzheimer's. And so I try to explain to folks what that's about. And that it's sporadic episodes of Alzheimer's. And so sometimes she's a little more lucid and sometimes not. And again, these are things we don't talk about in our culture. There's a stigma around any type of mental illness or any type of impairments.
My dad had actually told me, even though he knew that it was Alzheimer's, he was told not to say that because he was afraid he couldn't get insurance or couldn't get certain benefits. So the doctor had sort of told him, but never really wrote it down in his records.
We never really talked about his Alzheimer's situation, but in trying to clean up and poking around, I found brochures.
Can I ask why you chose not to talk about it with him?
He was such a proud person, and I think it would have just been devastating to talk about it. I mean, if we're someone else, it might be different, but for him, it just wasn't really the right thing to do. And I'm glad I made that decision because we just try to keep things as pleasant and happy as possible. And if he had known that, that would have just worried him, and I'm not sure what he would have done. Yeah. Might have been more damaging than I wanted to
Right.
take the risk, right? And at some point, what difference does it make really to the person? It's the family member that has to figure it all out and make the right decisions.
Martha, you said something very poignant about what Waho said to you.
You're going to make me cry.
Here's the...
No, I've got some, thank you. Always in my
just
pocket.
In case.
No, well, the two things really. One was that we were kind of on a little getaway together and just sitting overlooking the ocean. And he said, "Why did this happen to me?" Because he was still, aware enough that he knew that this was happening.
How old was he?
He was 58 when he was diagnosed, so younger onset. Yeah. I was able to say to him, well, my understanding is that there are several things that people can do to prevent it, and I listed all of them, and I said, you've done all of those. It's not your fault. And the other thing that he said that was really hard, it's probably why you were, sorry, I just, was that after he had stopped working, he said, well, if I can't work, what good am I to you?
Because he was a devoted provider.
Well, yeah, he always, I'm a retired psychotherapist. I worked for nonprofits all my life. So he made more money than he was the primary, I mean, I was working, but he was the primary wage earner. Yeah, and that was, and as I think is true for a lot of us, and maybe a little bit more for men than for women, I don't know, the identity gets really wrapped up in your work and not being able to work and not be able to support the family. It was very hard for him.
What'd you say back to him?
I don't remember specifically. I probably hugged him.
I don't remember which of you had this great comment about something would happen that signaled kind of a new level of the disease, and it just became the new normal. And you knew it at that point. And I think, Sheila, it was you and your sister with your dad in New England on a vacation that I was remembering.
Yes, it was back in 2008.
So
and we
give
were,
us the scene.
We were driving, we're from New England, and so my mother was like, I'd love to go back east. So we said, let's all go down. We'll go back there. So we flew to Boston and met up there, and we have still relatives there, so we drive around, and we went up to New Hampshire, Maine, visiting people, and so we were in Booth Bay Harbor, and there was a beautiful old library, and it was closed, but there were books, just used books outside, and we were big readers in my family, and so we were looking at the books, and my father just said, I need to go to the restroom, so we're like, oh, it's right behind, and this is what we didn't realize he was bad, would get lost. So it's right behind there, there's public restrooms. He said, okay, fine, I'll go and I'll be right back. And then it was like 15 minutes later, I'm like, where is he? So then I went and looked, and he was way down the end of the street, and he was just like looking lost.
Well, Emmy, I remember you were one of those who talked about there was a fall that happened.
This was before my mom's dementia got really bad, so she basically had sort of mild cognitive impairment, and we had part-time help, if you will, no one in the evenings. And I was in LA, actually, that weekend, and it must have been, I think it was probably a Saturday night, and my dad at some point had fallen, and my mom was just, she was 4'10", like 100 pounds, so there was no way she was going to be able to get him up. But instead of calling anyone, they didn't call 911, they didn't call me, they didn't call anyone. They ended up basically spending the night on the floor. So my mom brought like pillows and like a blanket, and they just like slept there until the next morning. And then when I came in, I think my mom must have opened the door. I can't remember exactly. And I see in the living room, there are these pillows and the blankets. I'm like, what's going on? Are you having like a camping, it's like you're simulating a camping trip or something? And she's like, no, your dad fell and I can't get him up. And so I was able to get him up, but it was one of those things like, why didn't you call me? Because I was like 10 minutes away in a Marriott in Burbank. And it was just one of those things where I think it just didn't occur to her. She was, too disoriented, I think, to call. So yeah, they spent the night on the floor, just the two of them.
And
really
Mark,
sad.
you also
Yeah, I had
shared
a similar
story.
situation to that. My children live in Utah, so my wife and I were actually on our way back home from a trip to visit them. And the cell phone reception in places in Nevada isn't always that good. So we pulled off the road at an interchange, and I sort of had to walk around to be able to get through. I did call my folks, talked to my dad briefly. He said, I asked him how they were doing. He said, I'm doing fine. And then I said, how's my mom? And he said, she's on the floor. Oh, I see. And we talked about that for a little while. So I said, well, how long has she been on the floor? And he said, oh, a few days.
Oh my gosh.
I don't think that was really the case, but that's what he thought. And I believed him when he told me that. So we actually ended up calling 911 to get an ambulance for my mom, but explaining to my dad that he was going to call 911 was a little tricky. So he said, oh, so an ambulance is going to come. I said, no, Dad, you're going to call an ambulance. So that was a difficult situation for sure.
Yeah.
You just lose pieces of yourself all through the journey. He was self-employed, and so for a long time he didn't want anybody. We couldn't tell a lot of his friends because they were also coworkers, and he wanted to be able to go on working, and he was afraid they wouldn't hire him if they knew that this was beginning to happen. And I finally got permission from him to tell a couple of people that he worked with most often and ask them to let him or me know when he shouldn't be working anymore. So I did get a call one day from a woman, Diana, who he had worked with a lot, who was a friend. And she said, I just wanted to let you know my next call is to Wahoo to tell him he had just traveled out of state. I don't even remember where, to do about a week-long shoot with her. And she said that a lot of it was unusable, that he had not had the camera on when he thought he had, didn't have it on when he should. It was, and she said, part of it's my fault because I didn't look at the dailies like as faithfully as I should have and catch it in time. But anyway, she called him, and she called and told me he can't work anymore. So she did call him and talk to him about it, and then he told me.
He told you, she talked to him about it?
Yeah, she called me and said, I'm going to call Wahoo, but I wanted to give you a heads up. And so then she called him. Because she was doing him the courtesy of telling him directly and not having it be on my shoulders. So we talked about that, and it was a pretty sad day.
My dad was falling prey to a lot of scams. Like if you get something in the mail, it's just like, you should give us money or Social Security is at risk. Some organization basically scamming people, and my dad was writing lots of checks to a variety of these organizations, and including, I guess, something for like Saving the Wolves, which anyway is something that I guess he would not normally do. And you tell him, like, Dad, you wrote this check for Saving the Wolves. Saving the wolves? What?
Some of you talked about how some of their behaviors became very different than how they were before Alzheimer's. And, either an exaggerated reaction or a violent reaction or aggression that wasn't who they were. And so I would like to, and I know most of you had something like that, so I'll start with Gloria.
Sure. So Arthur was a project manager for the federal government, and he was pretty detail-oriented and, pretty structured. Although he was gregarious and enjoyed people, he was always the social butterfly at events. And so when the Alzheimer's began to really take hold, he was not able to do some of the things that he would be able to do in the past, and he would become quite agitated. In some cases, very agitated. There were a couple of incidences on the block, and we've lived on the block for 50 years.
And he was the guy that would see if...
He's the one that would go down to City Hall on behalf of one of the neighbors and be an advocate for them. And then to flip the switch and just kind of almost charge at the person, they didn't know how to react. And so I ended up going to each of their homes on the block and explaining Arthur's situation. And the neighbors were so understanding. A number of them had relatives who had Alzheimer's or dementia. And so they understood, but he would try to stop traffic in the middle of the street, and it just caused all kind of havoc for a while. That has stopped. So he's in another phase of his Alzheimer's, but that was a very difficult time for all of us. Police came a couple of times, and
prior to this phase now, where my mom is a lot more, she's easily agitated. She wants to sleep a lot. She's very, let's say she wakes up and you're trying to take her to the restroom or something, she'll react very differently than she would in the past. And so one specific example, and this is kind of recent, a couple months ago, it was the first time, and she gets a little upset when, you take her to give her a bath, and she's afraid of the water, it doesn't feel good on her body. And so she was sleeping, just like a 20-minute nap, and I remember I was getting her up, and I was about to take her to the restroom, and you know, sometimes she'll recognize you and sometimes she won't. And I think she woke up kind of in the midst of half asleep, and she kind of smacked my hand really hard. And at first I kind of just was very taken aback. You know, of course I didn't expect it. And then I remember I just got very teary-eyed because it was in that moment, you know, similar to what, Gloria, what you're saying is, it might be easier on you at that time, but you're realizing the disease is progressing. And so for me, it was really in that moment. I mean, I've had a lot of these moments where it's suddenly like, oh my gosh, Mom is really progressing and you know, really declining and getting worse.
My mom, she had bouts of aggression as well, sometimes toward my dad, which was really kind of heartbreaking. But this one time, she was just really upset, agitated, aggressive, and they were standing, her and the caregiver were literally standing on the sidewalk right outside the door, right outside the house. And the caregiver is like, Emmy, you know, your mom, she's screaming. And I could hear my mother screaming in the background. You're so stupid. I mean, she's just, I mean, and everyone in the neighborhood could hear, right? Because the one thing my mother never lost was her voice. So she's super loud, really tiny, very loud, right? Kind of like our Welsh corgi, really small, very loud bark. But, and I could not calm her down. You know, she gave me the phone to try to calm my mom down. I was like, what's going on? What's happening? And you could tell the caregiver was very upset, and it was humiliating or embarrassing for her too, because, you know, she's standing outside, people are beginning to peek out their windows and wondering what's going on, and my mother is calling her stupid and other really not nice things. And so I said, I finally told her, I said, just try to get her in the house. Once you get her in the house, just leave. Like, we'll pay you for the rest of the day, but you need to remove yourself from that situation, because I didn't feel that she deserved that. And I'm also an employment lawyer by trade. I'm like, this is a lawsuit waiting. So she left, and thankfully she was fine the next day, and she continued with us. But it was a really difficult situation, you know, and you don't want the caregiver to be in that situation. You also want your parent to be safe, so you're trying to balance all of these things. But thankfully, you know, she was calm the next day.
Mark talked to me about wandering, and I don't know if others have wandering stories, but I'd like Mark to tell a couple of your dad.
Sure. Yeah, there are several that ended up being kind of troubling. My mom had some physical disabilities, so she had this go-kart kind of device. I think she bought it at Walmart, and my dad would use it when he'd go shopping. She would send him to go shopping, and it worked out perfectly fine for that. One day he decided to go for a ride, and they live on Rengsdorf, and he ended up all the way over by Foothill Expressway.
Like 3 miles away.
Yeah, he realized that this was a street that he didn't know. Fortunately, he knew not to cross that street. So he was, at that point, he was still able to use the telephone. So he called me and told me that he went too far, but we didn't know where he was. So it was a bit of an exercise to figure it out, but eventually we did.
Can you describe your father as you grew up, like what you saw your father as?
Well, yeah, he was a firefighter, and he was in the Army, and he was always quite I always looked up to him. He was always in defending others and public interest, public service.
And Gloria, you told me something, it's not a wandering story, but just how different the behavior could be from the man you had 50 years with before, and that was the napkins. So do you mind sharing?
Oh, jeez. We spent lots of time in different restaurants. We enjoyed going out to eat. We would just, pick a new restaurant. And I began to notice when we returned to the car, Arthur would have a napkin, the cloth napkins. And he was so clever. While we were eating, I never realized he was putting the napkins in his pocket. So we must have at least 20 napkins at our house, all different colors. And so towards the end, we of course don't go out to dinner as now, but I would tell the person, the waiter, do you have any paper napkins? And they just look at me real strangely. I said, you have to understand, my husband loves to take the cloth napkins with him. And so if you just bring several paper napkins, then you won't have to worry about what happened to the napkin. You'll see napkins, Kleenex, paper towels, and they'd all be stuffed in his drawer, several drawers in his man cave area.
In everybody's situation, even though there are moments that are more lighthearted or that are more connecting and we look for the positives, as you've so eloquently said, there are other times where we just feel totally overwhelmed by it.
If I'm under an inordinate amount of stress, like there are times, well, I'll have a migraine. And I remember there was this one particular instance where early on, you know, after she was diagnosed, my mom had a very difficult time with coping with the loss of, you know, no longer working and just all of the change. I mean, it was very overwhelming for her, and you could see that it was. During this time, you could tell there was a lot of like pent up anxiety. And she was trying to sort through whatever was going on. So she'd wander around the house, and I don't know, I can't recall correct, or specifically, I want to say I was probably a little sleep deprived. I think I'd slept like 3-4 hours the night before, and then gone to work, and then came home, and I was doing the mom duty, if you will. And I was really stressed out. I don't know what brought it on. And the migraine came on, and I just remember like becoming very sensitive to the light and to sound, and my mom's just walking around and she won't stop pacing, you know, and that's all I hear, her footsteps like just everywhere, all over the house, you know, and she's going to the door and she's moving the doorknob, and she's looking for my dad, really what's going on, because her and my dad did everything together. And so now she's home and he's at work in the evenings, and she's wondering why he keeps leaving her, and she's sad and mad at him that he's leaving and not realizing like she's sick. And so I remember it just got so bad, and I actually fell to the floor. And I just remember like kind of almost blacking out, but not really, enough to the point where I was able to grab my phone, and I called my sister and my brother-in-law, and they came. And thank God they lived close enough. And so those were the moments, like especially that one, it was very frightening for me. I was very scared. And I just remember thinking to myself, you know, if something happens to me, how can I care for her? Like, what can I do?
He woke up in the morning and was very confused. I mean, not just confused, but he was having a psychotic episode. He did not know where he was. He did not know who I was. And he had gotten up and gone to the bathroom and then came back into the room. And I was just kind of waking up thinking, oh, okay, so we're starting the day. And I got out of bed, and he curled up on the bed in this almost fetal position and was just terrified, but couldn't tell me what he was terrified about. And this is going to sound weird. I had a sleep shirt that had bears on it that are like about this big, you know, it's like hibernate was the joke in the sleep shirt. And he became frightened of the pictures of the bears. So that was really awful. And that was toward the end of, that was one of the indicators that led me to think, after I told my kids about it too, they got very quiet and then said, so Mom, is it safe for you and for Daddy to have him at home? I was like, oh, I kind of hadn't thought about my safety. He eventually I just sat on the bed with him, and a touch is just so important in my voice. And, you know, and eventually he calmed down. My memory is that I was able to get us both dressed, and we just kind of went outside and walked around a little bit. And that helped too, that somehow being outside and kind of in our very familiar neighborhood seemed to help too.
We brought him into the emergency room, and he had to get a catheter, and he didn't understand what it was. So he yanked it out. I can't imagine how painful that would be. So I think he did that more than once. So they actually had to put a straitjacket on him, and this was extremely difficult. And he started yelling at me, and it was sort of the only time he really verbally abused me ever. And it was just very hard for everybody, certainly the people that had to do it, and my wife and I. And
What are your memories of the beginning of the staying in a facility or moving them there?
well, my mother was the one who had to like sign the paperwork because she was still able to do so. So that was hard for him to kind of understand what was going on. On the other hand, my mother really did understand it, and she was signing it. And as she was signing it, she just started crying and weeping and bawling, and she just burst into a pool of tears. It was really sad. But eventually she realized that she had to, because she knew that she couldn't take care of him, and I couldn't take care of both of them.
When we were trying to even discuss it with my mom, it was just no.
I didn't tell him, I didn't talk to him about moving him out of the house. He was, sounds awful, he was far enough gone then that he kind of didn't get a vote. And I feel bad about that, but he wouldn't have agreed to it or wouldn't have remembered it the next day. So I took him to the facility after we had moved some of his stuff there, and lied to him about why we were there and left him there. So
Not easy.
no.
Not an easy script at all. And especially with the age that this amazing cameraman came down with Alzheimer's is something that's hard to, it's hard to hold it. Yeah, you've been through a lot.
Yep. Gray hair.
Yeah. I remember you talking about romance at the facility.
Oh, yeah. Well, if you live long enough to be in your 80s or 90s, you know, you're a hot commodity as a man in a skilled nursing facility. And so some woman who actually was living in the memory care, the life guidance, but still had her spouse in the independent part, decided my dad was her husband. And so he, you know, fed into this delusion that this is his wife, and if any time we would go to visit, he doesn't want to leave her. She's like, "Oh, Ron, don't leave." You know, and so that was kind of hard. And then, of course, I mean, like I said, I wasn't there, but that yes, some altercation or argument, and
They were fighting over her?
yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Your dad had a point where you were told he's kind of not appropriate for this facility level anymore.
That's correct.
Right? Somebody else brought that up, I think
It's a
Sue,
risk.
about
Yeah.
you're always worried. Are you going to get the call where they say he can't be here anymore? And can you share how that happened?
What it is it was a formal eviction notice, the sort of thing you'd expect to get if you didn't pay, the rent.
He was going to a really good senior day program in Mountain View that's run by Avenita's, the senior center there, because I was still working part-time, and it didn't feel like a good idea for him to be home alone. He wasn't a wanderer, but it just the lack of stimulation if I was going to be gone for 4 or 5 hours. So I talked him into trying that out, because he was not very excited about it, for 2 days, and then it went to 5 days, and he was there for over 2 years. And again, the decline was such that at some point the staff there said he's not really be able to participate very much in the program here, and not now, but in a while. We're probably going to ask you to find other placement.
They have a receptionist right by the front door, and part of her job is to make sure that the people who are inside don't go outside. My dad had been a building inspector for a while when he was retired, and he just knew a lot about the buildings. So there are only about 4 units that are independent living. And he went to one of the independent living units when the maid was cleaning it. So he went through the door and then went outside to the front. So he was outside in the front. And it was a pretty sad situation because he had to go to the bathroom. So he sort of walked down the street and then found an ATM and assumed that that was a toilet. But one of the ladies who worked at the hospital, was a facility, was on her way home, and she saw him. So she stopped, turned around, and said, "Let's go back in again."
Wow. But that led to him being
Evicted.
evicted. there's some touching sides throughout this, and I'm thinking of Sheila, your Wednesday nights.
I would come home some nights and he would say, hey, come in here. And he'd already be in bed if it was later. And I could tell there was something different because he had some energy, you know, at night. And I'd say, what's up? And he said, sit down. I've got some news for you. We're going to be moving one time we were moving to Singapore, Chicago, Hawaii. The business was sending us over to fix it because he was a very good businessman. And we were going and, you know, we would go into these, it would be an hour-long story. And I'd say, and what else are we going to be doing there? And he'd say, you know, well, who else should we bring? I'm like, well, how about, you know, so-and-so? Yeah, that's a good idea. We'll bring them too. And then he would say, what about a car? Do we need to buy a car? I'm like, oh, it's cheap to live over there. We'll just have a driver. Oh, that's a great idea. And then he told me that he said, I'm going to buy you a whole new wardrobe. And I said, oh, why don't we just wait till we get over there? Because they make everything over there anyway. So we'll just buy the clothes there. He's like, okay, perfect. And then, like, you know, we just would go, it was so much fun. I wish I recorded it. But then he said, but I think you're going to be very happy with the salary. And I said, I'm like, oh, this is going to be a good one. I'm like, what am I going to be making? And he said, we're doubling what you're making now. I really wanted to know what it was going to be. So that happened a few times, and I just went with it. And I'm like, this is just, I'm loving the energy. I don't care if it's all crazy. It's hysterical.
Absolutely.
And it was a gift, you know, because he loved working, and he just felt like he still was. So it was great.
Gloria, you've referred to a gift as well in Arthur's life, and kind of yours too, in terms of the caretaker takes some place.
When the caregiver entered into our family, I call him one of our family members now, in his culture, they have lots of family activities. So Arthur goes to Tupperware parties, he goes to Chuck E. Cheese, he goes to, you know, Avon parties, and he would have never, ever broached going to any of those kinds of activities. But he has the best time, and he comes home, and he is just, you know, kind of a different person, similar to with your dad. And I just play it up to the hilt. And the caregiver is a happy camper because he feels he's making a contribution towards Arthur being as happy as he can be. So, yes, I'm sure he doesn't even know what products Avon has, but it doesn't really matter. They're eating while they're there, so they're both happy about that.
Thank you all for the sharing tonight. I have a feeling there's going to be people in Wichita and Fargo and wherever that stumble upon your words, and it's going to be helpful.